Okay, so this is the third of three parts of going over the lecture slide for Chapter 13 on Monopoly. Regulating monopolies, why we might want to, how we might want to, antitrust laws, and a little bit about what price discrimination is and why companies often spend lots of money, especially like airlines, trying to do that. Okay, so monopolists, so first kind of getting into why we might want to regulate monopolies. To do that, let's do a simplified version of um, kind of the downward sloping demand curve, marginal revenue curve. That's pretty normal in this picture. But notice here that marginal cost is simplified to be a constant, right? Which is sometimes true, often of a natural monopoly, which is the type of monopoly that is often very often regulated, especially on price. So marginal cost being constant or roughly constant might be true. But the thing that is almost never true, the simplification here, is that marginal cost always equals average total cost, right? The only way that that could be true, right? Well, marginal cost would have to be constant for that even to be possibly be true. But that could only be true if there was no fixed costs, right? So here we're assuming there's only variable costs effectively, just to keep the graph a little simpler, right? Because the point that's trying to be made here doesn't need that piece of reality, right? So that we don't need that in this quote unquote model. Okay, so marginal cost equals average total cost, just to keep it simple. But the key here is that marginal cost is a constant line, and we're going to look at how that relates to the price that's charged if we have a monopoly, or instead, if we had the industry served by many companies getting close to perfect competition. Okay. So first, let's go through the analysis we just did in part 2. What quantity would this a monopoly company serving this in this industry, what quantity would they produce to maximize profit, and what price would they charge in this example? Well, recall the steps. So the company would pick the quantity at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Well, that happens at this point A, right? Which means that they would pick the quantity M, which in this case would be 8 diamonds, or you can think of it as 8 million diamonds, right, to make it more of a realistic market. But 8 diamonds, pick the quantity. And then the question is, okay, what price would they charge? So we do step 2. We have to go look and say, hey, let's look at the demand curve, because demand tells us what consumers are willing to pay. So if we go up from a quantity of 8, hit the demand curve at point B, take a left-hand turn to see where that height of that demand curve hits the price axis in this case, and it hits it at $600, and that's going to be the price the monopoly charges. Okay. What is that going to result in? Right. So quantity M, price M, and a large profit. Right. Economic profit, basically being this box here. Right. The difference between the price and not the marginal cost, but thinking of this horizontal line as the average total cost. That's why this is simplified here, to kind of just keep it a little bit more straightforward in the picture, right? Because there's a lot of things going on, right? So price minus average total cost is profit per diamond. So 600 minus 200 is how much you make per diamond. Economic profit times 8 diamonds, or what is that, $3,200, or $3,200,000,000 if this was 8 million diamonds. Right? So large economic profit if this industry is served by a monopoly. Let's think instead, however, if the monopoly is, say, broken up, which has been done historically before in industries. The reason that they're looking at diamonds here is because De Beers diamonds, as was discussed in part 1, in the 80s, I guess it was, pretty darn close to being a monopoly. And they would be setting diamond prices very high. Now, they still have a lot of market power, right? It's still not anywhere near perfectly competitive, but let's assume it was. Let's assume that Instead of there being one, there's thousands of diamond mines and thousands of companies selling diamonds. Where would the quantity likely move towards and the price move towards in the long run in that example? So let's think about the steps again in profit maximization. So if now we have this as a perfectly competitive firm, where this is a picture of each company's situation, or I guess this is the effectively the market now, cost structure at least. So what's the rule? Well, they're going to set the price equal to marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Well, this is no longer the demand curve, right, for the company, right? In a perfect competition, this is still the demand curve for the market, right? And when we had a monopoly, the monopoly was the market, so that was the company's demand curve. But if it's perfect competition, basically what we're assuming here is that if the price is here, that means the supply, the market supply, with many companies would be somewhere over here. So price for each of those companies would be equal to marginal revenue, and set that equal to marginal cost. So you produce a quantity of 6. Again, keep producing as long as marginal revenue is at least as big as marginal cost. Well, so here, basically that happens in the industry in total up until we get a quantity of 16 diamonds, or 16 million, however, whatever this is representing. So quantity C and price C, because that's where it hits the demand curve, right? So quantity C and price C, where price equals marginal cost. And the thing that makes it long run equilibrium in perfect competition is that price equals average total cost, i.e. economic profit is 0, right? Price minus average total cost, there is no box to color in because price equals average total cost. So definition of economic profit, or I guess that's the graphical image of economic profit being 0. So basically, the conclusion here that the book talks about is that if we had a monopoly instead of a perfectly competitive industry, we have inefficiency, right? And what is that inefficiency? Well, effectively, it's this triangle of what we're going to talk about and realize on the next slide or highlight, going way back, right, to chapter 4 on producer and consumer surplus. That's basically lost consumer surplus that does not happen if we have a monopoly company only producing 8 diamonds, or 8 million diamonds, whatever this represents, at $600 a diamond, where it does happen, right, if we produce 16 diamonds at $200 a diamond, right? So this is economic activity. Between this 8 and 16, these 8 or 8 million, right, diamonds don't get produced and don't get bought. So this would have been more consumer surplus, right? It would have been because people are willing to pay, all the people represented here between point B and point C on the demand curve, on the market demand curve, they're willing to pay more than the cost of producing, than the marginal cost of producing those 8 diamonds, or 8 million diamonds, so that this is lost consumer surplus, right? Consumer surplus, remember, is everything below the demand curve, their willingness to pay above what they have to pay. Well, in perfect competition, they'd have to pay $200. So this is economic activity. It doesn't happen. Inefficiency. So it's basically lost consumer surplus, which is shown in this figure 13.8 in the book. Right? So if we have perfect competition, so it's basically breaking this up now into perfect competition versus if it's a monopoly. Okay. So if this was perfect competition, again, in this simplified world where there's no fixed cost, so that marginal cost equals price equals average total cost, this would all be consumer surplus, right? There's actually, in this example, simplified example, there's no producer surplus, right? Just to keep it simple. But all of this is benefit. And remember, if we went back to that chapter, on consumer and producer surplus, it was suggested that efficiency is maximized if we maximize total surplus. Well, there it is maximized. If, however, the industry is served by a monopoly, right, the first example we went over on the slide at this point, right, we see that, okay, they're going to produce only the monopoly quantity, which again, compared to this is the 8, right, whereas this quantity for the perfect competition was this 16, right? And they're going to charge this price M, which again was the 600 versus the 200. Right? And a lot of the consumer surplus, what would all be consumer surplus in the simplified example, right? When marginal cost and average total cost were the same, consumer surplus would only be this tiny little piece. Now, from what this is often called welfare economics, right? From a welfare economic standpoint, economists would not, so total surplus maximized. In welfare economics, economists would not typically say, well, this is this piece that goes to producers, right? Because now this is producer surplus, right? They're willing to produce, right? They could make money producing everything up through here. They're charging a price of PM, so everything below the price they get, above what they'd be willing to produce it for, right, this marginal cost piece, is producer surplus, right? So that's not lost, it's just transferred from consumers to producers. So not great for the consumer, but from a pure welfare economic standpoint, not lost to the system. Okay, but what is lost to the system is these, all of the diamonds between this quantity M and this quantity C, right, on this graph, between this quantity M of 8 and this quantity C of 16, this economic activity doesn't happen with a monopoly. So that's why it's the inefficiency. That's why it's the deadweight lost, sometimes called the social cost of having a monopoly as opposed to a perfectly competitive market. Right? So this is, again, often called welfare economics, or some basics of welfare economics, and why we're going to talk about antitrust laws and regulating monopolies, because to try to avoid at least some of this deadweight loss. Okay, so now, just as a review, why, just verbally, so for perfect competition, companies in perfect competition, or any company, right, they produce, like we've talked about in the last 2 chapters, the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But in perfect competition, that happens where price also equals marginal cost. So as we just saw in the graphs, that meant that size of that surplus, or in the example we just went over, it was all consumer surplus, but the size of the total surplus, producer plus consumer, is as big as it could possibly be. Whereas for the unregulated monopoly, they still produce the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, but we get the deadweight loss, right? We don't maximize total surplus because they charge that higher price that's above the marginal cost. Okay, so again, that's a justification why we might want to try to make industries more competitive, try to avoid monopolies, or in the case where a monopoly might make sense, i.e. in the case of a natural monopoly, perhaps regulate them on the price, and then we'll talk about how we might do that. So first we'll talk about making industries more competitive, right, or making sure there's enough competition to not have tremendous amounts of deadweight loss. I always think of it as there's this tension in capitalism, right? If you're a company, you want more market share, you want more power, you want more monopoly power or market power. So you want to get bigger, right? You want to have more dominance in the industry. It gives you a lot of flexibility on price, more flexibility on pricing, often all kinds of things, on setting standards, et cetera, et cetera. However, if you're a consumer, as we just saw, you're better off going if the industries are closer to perfectly competitive. So it's this kind of this natural tension, right? So to I guess maintain the competitive benefits or the benefits of competition that fosters innovation, that fosters companies trying to improve on things. You need to let them get some benefit from that and perhaps grow, but need to decide, well, when is that getting too extreme? When is it getting to the point where there's not enough competition and they start having too much power? That's where antitrust laws, right, to try to reduce, avoid monopoly, or often called market power, right? So antitrust laws really, most of which started to come into existence back in the turn of the 19th century with Standard Oil. Right? They were basically had over 90% of the U.S. refining capacity, and they were doing all kinds of things with their pricing that was very anti-competitive. And then finally the government stepped in. All right, we got to start making some rules to this, more rules to this capitalism game that was more of a free fall, wild, wild west in the 1800s, right? So some of these antitrust laws, which is basically anti-monopoly laws, make industries more competitive. So sometimes the government steps in, and if companies want to merge, which inherently reduces the number of competitors and how much competition there is, they might prevent or put restrictions on those mergers, right? So there was an example like 3 years ago, I guess they started this process. AT&T wanted to merge with Time Warner, but in many markets, right, they were very powerful, so the government basically tried to block that merger. Now I say tried because just because the government wants to, it then goes to the court system where the government has to prove their case that this would reduce competition too much and be detrimental, and there's not exact rules, but effectively in this case, the court basically ruled to allow the merger to go through. So it was in the courts for a while. Right? So that merger happened. But there's been other times where they have not, where they have actually stopped companies from merging, right? Or put restrictions on them. For example, when Anheuser-Busch wanted to merge with what was it? Anheuser-Busch wanted to merge with Coors, I believe it was. Basically, they would have had half the world's beer market, so they had to divest some of their holdings. Like I think it was Molson they had to get rid of, because in some markets they would have been so dominant that there would have effectively been very little competition. Kind of funny in beer, but that was one thing. When I worked for American Airlines wanted to merge with British Airways. The UK and the US government said, not so fast, right? You guys, those two airlines, American and British Airways, had over half of the travel market between the United States and London Heathrow Airport, the busiest international airport in the world. And basically they said, well, if you want to merge, you have to give up a bunch of your takeoff and landing rights. Right, X number. It was a couple hundred landing and takeoff rights a week, because that's a constrained airport that basically, there's not room for more airlines to fly there unless someone flies less. They're at capacity. When the numbers were crunched, right, American and British Airways said, you know what, that's too valuable of a cost, right? The benefits of the merger aren't worth giving that up, so we didn't merge with British Airways. Started a code share, which is a whole other can of worms, but did not merge. Sometimes, right at the extremes, antitrust laws have been used to break up companies. Case in point, Standard Oil. They used to have 90% of the U.S. oil refining capacity. They were broken up into Exxon and Mobil, which now again have remerged more recently. Shell, Chevron, right? Still some of the biggest companies in the world, but it all used to be one. So they were broken up. AT&T was broken up, right? Now you think of AT&T likely as the cellular telephone company, right? It used to be kind of all the regional telephone companies as well, and they were broken up into 13 regional Bell local telephone companies and a long distance company, right? So now they're effectively the long distance one. So break up companies if they're deemed to have too much power. Not too much of that happening lately, but there have been some calls, right, for divestitures in say, for example, Facebook. Um, other types of things that try to keep there be enough competition, not to have so much deadweight loss, and to keep industries working relatively well for consumers. Prevent companies from performing activities that makes markets less competitive. So the Supreme Court, for example, ruled in 2019 that Apple was basically doing anti-competitive practices. It was something to the effect where they were deleting things off of iTunes that were not purchased from iTunes, or from something to that effect, right? They weren't allowed to do that, so they had to stop. Another example was maybe a decade before that, when the Microsoft got in trouble for bundling their operating system, right, their Windows operating system, with the Internet Explorer, basically saying, hey, PC companies, if you want Windows operating system, you have to install our internet platform, Internet Explorer. Right? And they were basically forced to stop doing that. And there are countless other examples trying to keep things more competitive, not use your dominance or strength in one part of it, one industry or one part of a market to control another, for example, in that case. Now, natural monopolies are a little bit of a different scenario, where you might not likely want to regulate it or try to make it more competitive in this sense, because this is a scenario where, if you recall, a natural monopoly is a situation where if you only have one company, as opposed to multiple companies, one company providing a product or producing a product for all customers, then the cost of producing that product, right, the average total cost of producing the product becomes lower if only one company does it, as opposed to if multiple companies do it, right? The example we used, and we can think about as we move forward doing this analysis, is a utility like Central Hudson delivering electricity, right? Not necessarily the production of the electricity they deliver, but literally the service of delivering those electrons, right, through the transmission lines to your house. Right? So that's not a case where we'd want to, as we analyzed earlier, it's not a case where we'd want to have multiple companies, right? It kind of makes sense to have one, or it can make sense. It would not make sense to have Central Hudson be an unregulated monopoly, right? Where they could do this, where they could charge whatever price maximizes profit, because if that was the case, they would charge much more to deliver electricity to our houses than they do, because most of us would pay for it, because we don't want to try to figure out all the logistics and challenges of trying to get off the electric grid, right? So they become a regulated monopoly. Jump forward here. So the question that we're going to analyze here is, so what price, right? How should they be regulated? What price should they be allowed to charge? Okay. So here might be what a natural monopoly looks like. What makes this a natural monopoly? Let's assume that the size of the market is somewhere on this graph. So say somewhere here, or let's say whatever here. But bottom line is the average total cost keeps going down the larger the quantity that this one company produces, right? So the government then says, all right, you can be a monopoly, right? We give you our blessing to be a monopoly. However, for that right to be the only company to deliver electricity to people's homes, you have to give up the ability to charge whatever price you want, right? So let's figure out what price makes sense. Now, books in general start with kind of the perfect competition ideal, right? Where, hey, if it was truly perfectly competitive, right, like we just talked about a few minutes ago, price equals marginal cost, right? So nothing, there's no units that are not produced that could be produced at an extra cost, right, at marginal cost below the price, right? Exists in perfect competition. Let's see what would happen. Well, marginal cost curve, in this case horizontal, right? Assuming it has to be below average total cost for it to keep going down, but we're assuming a constant marginal cost. Well, where does marginal cost equal marginal revenue? Well, when we hit the demand curve, right? So we produce this quantity where price equals marginal cost. Well, is that sustainable? Well, notice where average total cost is at that quantity. It's above the price, which means there would be a loss. Well, that's not sustainable, right? It creates a negative economic profit, so it wouldn't make sense. Central Hudson would say, well, thank you, but no, no reason to be in this market because we can't cover our costs and our opportunity costs. So go have fun. So that doesn't make any sense. Right? So what price could make sense, or what rule, I guess I should say, could make sense? Well, how about price equals average total cost? Because that also happens in the ideal scenario, right, of perfect competition, right? Remember, price adjusts up and down until price equals average total cost. It will also equal marginal cost, which won't be true here. But this is also the kind of the promise of the long run in perfect competition. So let's try and see how that could work here. So if you set price equal to average total cost, well, you again want to go someplace where that price hits the demand curve, because that will determine how much people are willing to pay. Right? That's our price curve, demand curve. Well, so if price equals average total cost, it happens where the average total cost curve crosses the demand curve. So here's the price we set. Here's the quantity that's produced. What's the box for economic profit or loss? Right? How much positive or negative economic profit or loss is there? Well, there's none. Economic profit is zero, because price minus average total cost is zero, because price equals average total cost. So economic profit is zero, just enough, right? So that's effectively the logic of what price the regulators would want to set. Now, I actually have some experience in this type of thing to say that literally is what most communities that have a natural monopoly like this do, right? One of my clients, after I left the airline, when I worked for Deloitte & Touche Consulting, was Colorado Springs Utilities. And what I worked on for like 15 months is helping them with their forecasting models that, amongst other things, they used to go to the legislature and say, hey, our costs have gone up, so you need to let us increase our prices for, whether it be, they were a four-service utility, whether it be water, electricity, or sanitation, etc. Right? So this is more than just theoretical. This is effectively what usually natural monopolies are regulated towards. Okay? Price equals average total cost. Economic profit zero, and zero economic profit is enough to stay in business. Okay, so that's our discussion of natural monopolies, for our discussion of why you might regulate them, how you might try to make industries more competitive when it's not a natural monopoly, maybe try to avoid monopolies, and if you want a monopoly, you probably want to regulate them on price. Okay, last thing, price discrimination, right? We've pretty much gone through the semester so far saying, hey, let's assume we have one equilibrium price in a market for a product. Well, in many markets, that's not true at all, right? So what are some examples of price discrimination? And, well, I guess first let's define price discrimination. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a negative connotation like the word discrimination generally conjures up, right? But price discrimination is simply a company selling the same good or same product at different prices to different customers, even if it's happening or often happening in the same location. So what are some examples of price discrimination? And we deal with it all the time. Right? Airline pricing. Right? Airlines spend crazy amounts of money trying to do price discrimination, trying to be able to somehow isolate those who are likely business travelers because they know they're likely to be willing to pay more, right? For reasons we talk about in the elasticity chapter. Hotels, right? Price discrimination. movie tickets, seniors price, kids price, um, military price, student price, right? All kinds of different. So even in the same movie at the same time of day, you have different people paying different prices. Okay. Coupons, quantity discounts, right? Those are all effectively forms of price discrimination because some of those, well, I won't say why, but they are because people pay different prices effectively because of those things. Financial aid is price discrimination, right? Remember how I tried to highlight in the beginning, this discrimination isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just treating, in this case, is just treating people differently for some reason, in this case by the price they pay. So financial aid, whether it be need-based or merit-based, right? People paying different amounts for their education. So absent that last one, which is often for nonprofit organizations. So the goal of price discrimination for profit organizations is kind of what we're going to focus on here, or organizations in business for profit. Although a lot of that still applies for financial aid, but let's not go down that rabbit hole. Okay, so goals of price discrimination. Well, pretty simply, increase the quantity that would be sold and the revenue that would come in, and for profit organizations anyway, the profit that they're going to make, than if they were only had one price. Or even more specifically, make customers pay closer to what they are willing to pay. What tells us what customers are willing to pay? The demand curve tells us what they're willing to pay. Right? So, as we'll see on the next slide, when there is the ability to do price discrimination, effectively it results in the company taking what would be consumer surplus absent the price discrimination and turning it into producer surplus. The first day of class, when I told about my experience at the airline and when I got disenchanted with my job, I might have actually said, I was thinking, what am I contributing to the world by basically trying to take every possible dollar from the traveling public by stealing their consumer surplus? If I did say that on that day, it might not have made any sense, but this is basically what I was talking about. Okay. So let's think about this. So here's a demand curve, right? Demand curve tells us how much people are willing and able to pay for something. So if this flight from Dallas to Houston that we've analyzed in prior chapters, right? If the price is $100 per ticket and there's 100 people on the plane, well, we don't have any price discrimination. We have one price, and the revenue is 10,000, and the amount of that revenue is the size of that box. Right? But let's imagine now we do have price discrimination. Well, how does that get the airline to steal some of the consumer surplus? Well, let's say we can get people who, business travelers who don't know for sure they're going to fly. So when they buy a ticket, they also buy the right to cancel the ticket and get a refund. Well, maybe we can charge them. Maybe they're willing to pay $200 for that privilege. Right? So we get that piece of consumer surplus. Exchangeable tickets. Well, okay, so maybe they're not willing to pay quite as much as if you can get a full refund, but you still have a lot more flexibility without having to pay change fees and stuff. So maybe they're paying $180. And then, okay, if you buy it 7 days in advance at least, right? You get to, you wait till fairly close to the end. So let's say you pay $150 for that. But if you buy it 21 days in advance, maybe you have to pay $120. But the only way that you get the price of the 100 is if you buy it more than 21 days in advance and you stay over, your departure and return has a Saturday night in between. Now that might seem like a strange rule, but that's literally trying to box out the business traveler from not getting that ticket, right? Because most business travelers, or many business travelers, when I was when I didn't work for the airline anymore and I worked for Deloitte & Touche and I'd go to Colorado Springs, I'd go weekly pretty much. I'd leave on Sunday or Monday and come home on Thursday or Friday, because I wanted to be home for the weekend, right? If my company had told me, hey, we got a better deal, right? Because we're going to fly you midweek and then, you can go there on Thursday and come home on Tuesday, and you effectively have your weekend and on Wednesday, Tuesday night and Wednesday, I'd say, well, no, thank you very much. And they wouldn't want to do that either, because why would they want me there on the weekend when most businesses are closed, right? So that's another way to kind of box out, right, the business traveler. So bottom line is all of these four little boxes above the price of 100 is now producer surplus that used to be consumer surplus. And in a nutshell, that is the main reason for price discrimination. Right? More profit. Okay, that I think that does. Oh no, so one more slide. So here are the figures in the book that talk about the same idea without a specific scenario. But it talks about, you can have price discrimination and different degrees, right? So you might only be able to figure out how to segment, which is how it's often called, how to separate out prices for maybe two different prices. And that would result in this type of price discrimination, where this much consumer surplus becomes producer surplus. Or three prices, where more of the original, if there's only one price, consumer surplus becomes producer surplus. And then perfect price discrimination. So theoretically, the best you could do, you charge every customer exactly what they're willing to pay, so nobody has any consumer surplus, and it all becomes producer surplus, right? That's effectively the goal of revenue management, right? At an airline, right? And again, why I got kind of disenchanted is like, there must be more to life. So hopefully my coming and sharing this with you all it certainly feels to me more meaningful than that process felt to me. Anyway, so that is the end of chapter 13's material. Okay, that's it.